Is it grace or grace plus works that saves? Let's look at the whole story. God says to Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars. And in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, it says, and he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned to him as righteousness. God justified Abraham at that very moment. 25 years later, Isaac is born. 15 years after that, God says to Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham does as God says. James knows when Abraham already had saving faith. He even quotes Genesis 15:6, and Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But James says more than that. In verse 22 it says, you see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Abraham's faith was working with his works, and the result was his faith was perfected. It was made complete. It matured. When Abraham believed God would give him a son and numerous descendants, God gave him righteousness. He was justified and saved in God's eyes. But Abraham's faith needed to mature. And Abraham stumbled and fell and got up and fell again and got up. And then 40 years later, between Abraham's salvation and his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham's faith grew and matured. And then God tested Abraham with the ultimate test. And Abraham obeyed God, and his faith was perfected. There would be no more tests. You can't get any better than perfect. But James adds one more thing. Abraham was called a friend of God. Now that's important. Who called him a friend of God? The people who knew Abraham. They heard the stories of how he left his home, went to the promised land, heard about the promise that he was going to be given a son, knew about his son, heard that he was willing to offer up Isaac, heard that story, and they called him a friend of God. If there had been any questions about Abraham and his relationship with God, they now knew Abraham and God are friends. They could see it. They witnessed it. Now, there's no contradiction between James and Paul. Paul says salvation comes from believing, not just intellectually, but from seeing our need for a Savior, discovering that Jesus is God's Son who died for us and rose again. We trust in Him and confess Him as Lord. That faith saves us. That faith is reckoned as righteousness, as true saving faith. Once we're saved, our faith needs to grow. It needs to mature. It needs to be perfected. And that's why we go through trials. They test us and perfect our faith. Faith that is real results in obedience to God. And as our faith produces obedience, people will see our good deeds. Get that? People will see our good deeds. And we will be justified by our works, meaning people will see our good works and know that we are truly followers of Jesus Christ. We're justified through faith in God's eyes. We're justified by works before people. God sees the faith that is invisible. Men see the faith when it's working. That's the difference between Paul's message and James' message.